Hello and welcome to The Confident Commit, the podcast for anyone who wants to join the conversation on how to build software better and faster.
If you're looking to build a trusted ship, tune in, let's confidently commit.
I'm your host, Rob Zuber, CTO of CircleCI, and today you're listening to episode 4 of season 2. I'm joined by Chandler Hoisington, GM of Kubernetes at Amazon Web Services. What we all refer to as AWS. I think no one actually says Amazon Web Services, right? But for anyone who's listening who doesn't know what AWS is, I'm sure that'll be a very, very helpful expansion. Anyway, thanks so much for joining me today, Chandler. It's great to have you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Awesome. Well, welcome. And let's kind of jump right in. So, I took a little beat as I gave your title, and we were joking about that before. GM Kubernetes, but I think there's some very specific things that you're working on at AWS around Kubernetes. So why don't you give us just a little bit of a picture of that?
Yeah, sure. No worries. When I first joined, I actually reported to Bob Wise, who was the actual GM of Kubernetes. And I came in to help build EKS Anywhere and a couple other products that really deal with kind of the edge and hybrid story around Kubernetes. So my title would be better served as GM EKS Edge and Hybrid or something like this. But those things were top secret, so they just slapped like the Kubernetes GM title on me. So yeah, that's what we're working on. We specifically launched EKS distro since I joined, and then we followed up with EKS Anywhere last year, and then we have some other cool new things coming out in the next 12 months or so.
Got it. Well, very cool. And I think that the that whole notion is fascinating. We're not going to spend a ton of time on it, but I think people should check it out. Like the notion of, okay, I have this cloud provider, and AWS changed so many things in terms of how we think about computing. But at large scale in large organizations, there's lots of different things that people are trying to get done, and just being able to adapt to that and have a more consistent approach and platform. I think is a very, very cool opportunity for probably some unique and interesting use cases, I would guess. Yeah,
you'd be shocked. Like everyone, before working on these types of products, you think like all these workloads are going to move to the cloud one day, which most workloads probably will. But then when you start getting into the edge and hypergame, you're like, oh, well, there's some really interesting workloads, oil platforms and cruise ships and, all sorts of things that still will need help running away from the cloud. So that's what we're going to help them do.
It's so great to hear that enumerated, because I think it's very easy to think everything's a SaaS offering. Like we even forget about embedded sometimes, just consumer devices, stuff like that, because everything's, now it's IoT and everything's connected to the cloud and whatever. But to actually think, wait a second, yeah, if I was on an oil platform, how would I expect to have consistent connectivity, right?
Exactly.
Like, I don't have it every day in my house. And my house is like in a pretty reasonable place to have connectivity, right? So, we talked a little bit about just before jumping on. We're spending a lot of time this season thinking about failure and learnings and stuff like that. But I think in the realm of failure, I would imagine network connections to some of these places are probably down more than they're up. So, a very, very interesting use case to think about. But for me, just looking at your background and knowing a little bit about where you've been and how you got to this place, I think there's got to be some really interesting lessons in there. In particular, as someone who GM of Kubernetes reporting to GM of Kubernetes, I'm going to try to get my head around that later. But someone who's been kind of in the Kubernetes space for so long, and in particular at the time when really everything came about, right? Like, in the arc of CircleCI, there wasn't even Docker when we started, right? Yep. And so then that fundamentally changed how we think about software delivery. And then it was like, cool, we can encapsulate things into containers and images. But now we have this sprawl of these, now we need orchestration. Like we're very good at creating new problems by solving old problems, I would say. And so that was like a little early days, Wild West, however you want to think about it, in terms of orchestration and just how are we building, everybody wants to build services, but nobody really knows how. And you were at Mesos, which eventually became D2IQ, right? So just tell me a little bit about those days, like where everything was kind of up in the air And then all of a sudden, everybody just went one direction, and every other provider was kind of just wrapping Kubernetes all of a sudden. Like, what was the shift that was happening right there?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I've told this story a couple of times because I've thought about it a lot, obviously, over the last couple of years. I think you really have to go back, actually, even earlier, and just to give all the context for people who might not know. But it's fascinating to me how many amazing features have come out of the Linux kernel. How many companies have been built based off of a few developers, committing a new feature to the Linux kernel, and then a couple years later, someone being like, "Oh, wait a second, we could build a business around this like one new feature." And I feel like that's what happened with containers. And I don't know the exact dates, but let's say they checked in C groups and namespaces to the Linux kernel, like 2008 or 9 or something like this, right? I don't know the exact year, but it was a couple years after that till Solomon started playing with it. It's like, whoa, what if I put a UX around this and made Docker? And it was this really interesting, like, perfect storm. I feel like he started doing that with those features. At the same time, you had people like Ben Heinemann, who was at Berkeley around that similar time, and he wrote a paper on Mesos, which was all about distributed scheduling. And specifically, he was scheduling Spark workloads, and Spark was also coming out of Berkeley at the same time. So you had this like perfect combination of that. And then you also had the Google people who had been working on Borg, and so they knew a lot about scheduling these kind of distributed workloads as well. And you had Cloudera doing some stuff with Yarn, and you had all that Yarn stuff happening. So you had these like distributed schedulers, and then over here in left field, you had these container workloads. Well, you were missing the one ingredient, which was really interesting at the time, which was like microservices, right? And so then you had groups like ThoughtWorks and these other kind of, these architect thought leaders, quote unquote, starting to talk about, hey, monoliths are bad. You need to break these things up into small individual pieces that can communicate to each other over an API and can be scaled independent of each other. So people started doing that, and they said, wait, we can put these in containers. And then they started putting in containers and said, wait, now we have a ton of these things. So how do we orchestrate all these containers? And that's really what started the like orchestration wars, I feel like, Yeah. And obviously Ben went and worked with Flow, who was the two co-founders of Mesosphere at Twitter, and then they brought Toby, who was working at Airbnb, and they made Mesosphere to specifically work on these types of problems. But then Docker at the same time said, hey, we need to monetize. What's the best way to do this? Oh, we're going to build Docker Swarm. And then Google's like, hey, we need to differentiate ourselves from these other clouds. We need to build something. Should we use Mesos or not? And they ended up building their own project. So you ended up with these three things that are all now competing against each other: Kubernetes, Mesosphere, DCOS, and Docker Swarm. And so it was a really interesting way to get there. It almost happened by accident. That whole market was born by accident. And then, that all kicked off. So I find that I don't know if that answers your question, but just the history of getting there, I find very fascinating,
Well, I think Rancher was in there somewhere
as
well.
And then Rancher was actually originally working on Mesos or something at the time. And then when they started seeing the tides turn towards Kubernetes, they went all in on Kubernetes as well.
Right. And so, what's really interesting, if you think about the trajectory, is like, we wouldn't have orchestration if a bunch of people hadn't tried it.
Right.
So I'm super thankful. I've spent a lot of my life in startups, but I'm always super thankful for people who've just tried things, knowing that 90% of them don't go anywhere.
Right.
Those were all good ideas, right? They were all sort of different versions or different flavors of the same kind of concept, which is, as you described, we all have microservices, we have containers, but it's really actually hard to have hundreds or thousands of these, right?
Yeah.
And then what's unclear to me is what went wrong, I guess, how did suddenly, I swear I just woke up one day and suddenly it was such clearly like Kubernetes is the winner. Everybody else is just trying to wrap Kubernetes and stay in the game sort of thing. Is there anything to learn out of that as an entrepreneur, a product builder?
Absolutely. I think, obviously, I've talked about this a lot. When I joined Mesosphere, it was right when we started to think about pivoting towards Kubernetes. And I was actually a customer of DCOS before that. I think it was a whole bunch of things that you could do a whole case study on, actually. But the things that kind of stick out to me is that Kubernetes and Google did a really, really good job around building a very strong community. And I think the basic architecture of Mesos was you had Mesos itself, which wasn't actually the container orchestrator. Mesos, provided some APIs for you to build a container orchestrator on top of that. You could schedule all sorts. You could build lots of different kinds of schedulers for Mesos. We had a Spark scheduler. There was a container scheduler, et cetera, et cetera. But what ended up happening was all the big Mesos users got kind of fragmented. So Apple had their own container scheduler. I think Yelp had one called Pasta, I think. And there was, all these major users. Uber had their own one. And I think Lyft had their own scheduler. And Netflix had their own Mesos scheduler. So all these big shops were using Mesos, but they all ended up building their own scheduler. Like there wasn't a consolidation around a single container scheduler. The one at Mesosphere that we built was called Marathon. And so that's what we use to schedule containers. But what was interesting was with Kubernetes, they didn't take that approach. They said it's all going to be self-contained, one scheduler. And so the whole community kind of rallied around one project. Where with Mesos, honestly, Mesos ran really, really well. And it continues to run really well for some big customers today. But it got fragmented, and we weren't able to bring all these big shops together working on kind of the one central thing. I feel like that was, if I had to put my finger on one thing, I think that's really what it was. And in addition to that, I think Google did a really good job with the CNCF and that whole ecosystem that got born. I think everyone did a really good job kicking that off. And there's probably a whole other slew of things that happened in there that you could really analyze. But I feel like that architecture difference was really the main one I always go back to.
Sort of after the fact armchair analysis. Usually you pick one variable and spend a whole bunch of time on it. But the one that you called out, which is sort of the balance between great abstraction, right? Mesos being like fantastic for a bunch of different things, and then people building tools on top of it, but then everyone's got something different, versus we're going to go solve the problem of container orchestration because that's what everyone is trying to solve today. I think from a product perspective, from an engineering perspective, that's something we always grapple with, right? Like, how easy is this for users versus how customizable, and what's the balance that they need? And it's different in every product, in every context. But I think reflecting on that is a really, really good point. So the other thing that's interesting for me as a consumer of these technologies is, in the early days of something like this, we all say, okay, we absolutely need this, but there's 5 choices and we do all this evaluation, whatever. And then probably if you look at those 5, it may have been up until the tipping point, 1/5 of users were using each of them, sort of thing, which means 80% of people using container orchestration had to start over because all the other ones went away, right? So was there anything to learn, you think, about like software selection, technology selection, maybe just wait longer until you see the dust settle a little bit? Like, any thoughts on that?
Yeah. That's interesting. I do think there were some users that are migrating from Mesos to Kubernetes today. But one of the nice things, and I'm not saying it was an easy transition for anybody, is that it all was wrapped around containers at the end of the day. So you weren't like rewriting your whole application. There was a big lift, and there is a big lift to move from Mesos to Kubernetes. That's just the reality. They're completely different platforms. But you weren't completely rewriting your application, luckily. So there at least was that abstraction that kind of helped people. But look, I actually subscribe to the thought that I like customers who are pushing that edge and eating that cost of potentially making the wrong decision, because even though they might have to switch, they've moved so much faster to that point by picking some of this newer technology that enables like faster development time, faster deployments for their architecture, like happier developers. You're able to recruit better developers because you're working on the latest and greatest stuff. You're not being as conservative. And I feel like you're gaining a lot of time with all those little decisions, and it's hard to quantify. And sure, you might lose some time in the future because you're like, oh, we picked, this CNI instead of this other CNI that ended up being super popular. Like, okay, that's the tax of moving fast. And I just kind of consider this all just a tax of moving fast. I don't think it's necessarily a lesson of people should start slowing down and really like, okay, wait until these companies get to their Series E and they have a certain amount of revenue, and they're doing they're in a certain number of major accounts. Like, somebody has to be first. And I feel like the what you gain from using things like DCOS at the time vastly outweighs the switching costs in the future if you happen to be wrong.
Yeah, I think that's a real, like you talked about somebody has to be first and sort of the early adopters. I mean, think about the adoption curve, right? And probably a huge part of that is knowing where you as an organization are, and maybe even within an organization, right? If I'm a large org, then I might have some specific projects that are a little more nimble, can try some things, and I don't have to make this sort of lift and shift type investment in new technology, but can maintain some nimbleness around, oh, this might be useful to us in the future. How do we make sure that we understand it and we don't get left behind? And, to the point of if we all waited until any provider was post E with a certain amount of revenue, no one would ever get there, right? So
that's right.
I guess we should be thankful for that. And it's a little bit of like, as a community, we all have to contribute a little bit to pushing these technologies along.
That's right. And this is nothing compared to like front end frameworks or something like that. Like that space moves about 1,000 times faster than the infrastructure space. So even if you're like, oh no, I had to switch between, Docker Swarm to Kubernetes, and that decision took 5 or 6 years, where you might have switched your front end framework 3 times during that time. So
3 times a year.
Yeah, exactly.
I love this sort of thought process of this outcome is inevitable. So how do I build for it different? And I always use front end frameworks as the reference. Like, we're obviously going to change front end frameworks every 12 months. So how do we make sure that we're insulated against that kind of churn? Right. And to your point, in the orchestration world, you were still building containers. Right. You're just putting them into a different it still work, but you're putting them into a different environment. But almost someone from the outside could redefine, okay, we're operating in this environment. Here's the configuration. Here's where we need to have secrets or environment variables, whatever. Right. And as a developer of a service, I might not even know that it moved. So, all right, so let's fast forward a little bit. Everybody decides on Kubernetes, so everybody tries to deploy Kubernetes. Right. That didn't go very well. We all had 4-year outdated versions, couldn't security patch them. Nobody knew what they were doing. And along comes, EKS, GKE, whatever. Just, okay, it would be super great if someone else would do this for me. Was that is that the arc? Was there, people wanted to get in early, and then it turns out that, I always say that we just like to shift complexity in software development. Like, we moved it all into the orchestration engine.
Yeah, I think the complexity also is largely in running the control plane. And that's what the EKS folks identified as well. It's like, hey, what's the hard part of this? And it's managing that control plane, because that's where you have etcd and your API server and all this kind of stuff. And those are the components that, have to get upgraded and CVE patched, and those where you have failures that are difficult to recover, and you have to basically become an expert on this technology. And it's a lot to ask every organization on the planet who wants to adopt containers and thus Kubernetes to also become an expert in this distributed orchestration tool. Like, that's a lot to ask. And so I think Amazon did what Amazon does best and said, we can remove that complexity and operate that for you. And that's really what's made EKS as popular as it is, because you have all these options, right? I think there's so many different options to running EKS. We kind of fit every scenario a customer might have. Oh, I want you to manage the control plane, but I want to manage the worker nodes. Like, okay, we can do that. Or, hey, I want you to manage control plane, but I also want you to manage auto scaling and a couple other things for me. And that's what our managed node groups are. So we have that. And the list goes on and on, all the way down to EKS Anywhere, where, hey, I want to actually manage the infrastructure and I want you to give me support for this thing. We're like, okay, we can do that too. So we've just kind of gone through and checked this box to kind of reduce the complexity and really meet the customer where they are as far as, what they want to handle on their side and what they want to offload to Amazon to handle.
That makes a ton of sense. And I'm sort of thinking about this learning from failure, and you said, okay, the AWS or EKS team identified this is the hard part, which means people had to go try it and fail at it.
That's right.
which means there was some pain they were trying to get away from, right? But it just ended up being out of the frying pan into the fire, or whatever you want to call it. What was that? Like, what led people to the point where they said, this is how I need to run my systems, and then, oh, actually, this is really hard. I need someone else to do this for me, and then I'm going to kind of go back to just building software.
Yeah, I mean, to give you an idea, at Mesosphere, we would do these things called mixed workload testing, which basically we would spin up a cluster before releases and like hammer it with a bunch of workloads, like Spark workloads and marathon workloads and just all sorts of things. And it's something we started doing because our customers were having a lot of issues, and we were like, why is this happening? And our customers, why aren't we finding this first? This is not okay. And it helped us in a lot of ways. But to give you an idea, I think it would take us a full day or more. And I think the first time we did it, it took us like a week or more with half the engineering team working on this. It was a really cool thing to watch. It was actually very collaborative. But just, we need a dashboard for that. There's no dashboard that exists yet. Okay, we're seeing this failure. Why are we seeing that? Oh, we need another dashboard for that. Oh, we need this. Okay, can someone fix that bug and then restart? And it was just this, it took us a really, really long time. And those are some of the best containers and distributed engineers in the world working at Mesosphere. I mean, there were some really impressive engineers there and still are. And, it took them that long to get those workloads working. So you can only imagine what some of our customers were going through it isn't their core competency to try to figure out distributed workloads like that. And, you just can't even imagine the kind of pain that they go through trying to get stuff up and running. And so I think that general complexity where you start layering on all these different pieces of the stack and trying to debug it is really what caused all that pain. And it's not, I think by hosting the control plane in the cloud, for example, like EKS does, you really remove a vast majority of that for customers where they can really just focus on package their application in a container, give it to us, and we'll figure out how to get that running.
Right. So that is, I think covers, once you're at this point, this is how you should do it. I mean, let's be honest, CircleCI, we're big fans of telling people like CI and CD is not the thing that you're trying to build. You're trying to build your product, like help us with this part. And then if you're going to run it in Kubernetes, let AWS, EKS help you with that part. But there's a big if in there, right? Like you're just trying to get a business off the ground. And I talk to people. I mean, I spend a lot of time talking to startups and I'm like, are you seriously trying to deploy 5 microservices? Like you could build this in a monolith. You could be in Heroku or some Lambda or something by this afternoon.
Exactly.
What are you doing? Like please
totally
don't
agree.
put your energy into this. So what's the threshold? Like kind of where's the point where you would say, okay, now I need to absorb this. And if you were in an organization like that, how would you know that you were ready? Because I think people say, oh yeah, we're going to deploy this. It's going to be amazing. And they're not paying attention to how much complexity they're about to take on. Like, how do you know that you need it and that you're ready to take it on?
Yeah, it's really funny. I actually talked to a good friend of mine who has been through this journey with me. And him and I both say, if we ever started a startup, 99% chance I'm just using Lambda and like 100% services. Like there's just no reason to even like spin a server up ever. And so I think you're absolutely right. If you can use one of these services, in my opinion, and I'm not just being an AWS homer, I thought this long before I joined AWS. You should just use AWS if you can, because I mean, they just do all that for you. Like, why go through that pain? But I do think for containers, there's the customers that I see having a lot of success with containers are the ones who need some portability. So they're looking for containers to kind of provide that abstraction layer, so that their applications do feel more portable. And 2, sometimes they have very specific like scaling requirements that they want more hands-on tuning for. Like their engineers want to say, hey, we want to be able to be a little bit more, little less black box about what's going on here. And so let's put this in a container and put it in EKS so we have a little bit more control over this. I'm not saying those are the only use cases. There's obviously a ton more, but those are the ones that like when I'm thinking about my own startup one day, those would be the reasons why it would be like, okay, let's think about maybe putting this in container. But that, I bet you 99% of the time, any startup that I could think of, I would try to just put this in like a Lambda or some kind of service that just handles this for me.
Yeah, I think this the simpler the better is
Yes.
usually a good thing to stick with, especially as you're trying to find product market fit, you're pivoting, whatever that might be, right? You're exploring, the faster you can move, the better. And usually you don't even know enough to break things up. But what about the ECS EKS split? Like we started actually the first time we started putting stuff into containers in AWS, we used ECS, and then eventually things got more complex. And so,
Sure.
is there kind of is that a stepping stone? I've met customers who are sort of going back, quote unquote, to ECS and saying, you know what, we actually don't need all this. We're gonna simplify things a little bit. How do you think about that split?
Yeah, I mean, ECS itself is a very, very popular, growing business. And so I think they've done a really good job at helping customers who want kind of the easy button with containers. And so that's really what ECS's main shtick has been, is like, hey, you want to deploy a container on AWS? We have all these native AWS integrations right out the box. We're the easy button. And they've been around longer than EKS as well, right? And so they really have a lot of maturity in that product. It's been really impressive to see joining AWS and seeing the success of that business. It was actually a little bit surprising to me coming from the outside. I was like, oh, this is a very popular, growing business. So yeah, I think you're right. And you'll see some people even go back saying, we don't need all this complexity of Kubernetes. We're going to try out ECS. So, I mean, it's really funny. Amazon, I'll tell you this, like, every company, and this being a founder and all this, every company has their company values. And when you join, you read them, and then you probably don't look at them again at a lot of companies. You don't even know what they are. But at Amazon, that's not what happens. It's really ingrained in the culture. They've done a really good job at that. And one of the things that really gets ingrained in our decision-making is customer obsession. And I'm not just, trying to be cheesy on the podcast. It's really true. And if customers are happy with ECS and they want more features from ECS, Amazon's going to continue to invest in that and continue to satisfy customers. I mean, that's just the basis of the whole argument. And if customers also want Kubernetes, we're going to build them Kubernetes and satisfy them with that too. So there's no limit to that. There's no like stuffing one product down their throat and, political turmoil internally and all this kind of stuff. That doesn't really exist. It's like if a customer wants something, we do our best to satisfy them.
Well, as a shout out to those values, since podcasting is not the only thing I do, you're not the first person from AWS that I've spoken to today, and you're not the first person who cited the customer obsession. So it's clear. I mean, almost everyone I talk to, raises that, and I think it's fantastic in how it gives guidance to what you're doing. And then, looking at those customers, right? It's so funny because I spend a lot of my time preaching the like simple. What's the simple thing you can do? How do you offload the things that aren't your core competency? I love that you've raised though, like we need someone to push the envelope. And I've enjoyed many times in my career pushing the envelope, right? Because I knew I was in a space where that was either I just had the time to have fun or it was something that we could afford or it was going to give us some value in some other way. And so huge shout out to all the people who are pushing the envelope and failing at it so that we can learn and build better things. It's kind of a model of communal failure and learning and continuous improvement versus just one person's or one group's continuous learning. So as a transition then, our final segment that we love, this Red Build Rewind, something, can you tell me a story or a highlight of something that, kind of felt like it was going horribly wrong, was probably catastrophic feeling at the time, but in the end taught you something that you've been able to carry through your career?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I'll give you one that's non-software related. My family grew up actually in the oil business. And so I spent a lot of time driving to Kansas from Colorado with my dad and sitting on oil wells. And it's really interesting learning about decision-making. I think I learned a lot about decision-making through that because before you drill a well in Kansas or something like this, you have a lot of data. You're looking at control points of other wells around that location. You're looking at, 3D data from sending sound waves down in the ground and reading them back. And you have a degree of confidence like, okay, we think oil is here, but it's still a huge unknown. And you go and raise the money for that. And when I got older, I actually raised money for some of my own wells and did this. And there's no more catastrophic feeling in your stomach at all than driving 12 hours home from central Kansas back to Denver after drilling a dry hole. And not just losing your own money, but losing investors' money. Like that is a moment of reflection that I don't think very many people have. And it feels extremely catastrophic at the time. And my business partner who might listen to this will get that feeling in his stomach right now, probably just even thinking about it. So it's rough, and you're thinking, what went wrong? We talked to all these geologists. We had a combined 250 years of experience in the Kansas oil industry telling us this was going to be a good location, and it's still a dry hole. And you learn a lot about moving past those failures, learning, but like that's part of the game sometimes is failing. And I think that's what you kind of learn is like you're kind of an acceptance of failure. It's not okay with you. You're not like, oh, let's go out there and fail, but you know that that's part of the game, and it doesn't like drag you down to the point where you can't produce anything in the future. So you have to learn from those failures and move forward. And I think that's a really interesting lesson to learn.
I love it. Congrats on being the first to throw out such a distant reference. I think there's rarely a time when I'm speaking that I don't make reference to this book, Range, which is all about sort of generalists in a specialized world and analogical thinking, like the ideas that you could take from other contexts and domains and bring them into your domain. And it's such a great, it's like, I mean, I'm trying to get my head around it. As someone who's started some companies that, didn't necessarily all go the way that I'd hoped.
Right.
All of that happening in like a day.
Yeah,
sort
exactly.
of being like,
yeah.
Okay, we either pass or fail in this one day. There's no like we're gonna pivot here, like we're gonna drill a little bit over here or whatever. It's just like it's all on the line in this one moment. Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
I wasn't there, and I feel a little bit of like I'm nervous. I'm nervous.
Gut, and it's similar to like when you like break a production server, that feeling in your stomach. Yeah. That's the same feeling. It's not a good one.
Right, but I mean we fix production servers all the time, right? Versus just I'm going to go raise some more money.
And let's do another one.
Let's try again.
Exactly.
Wow.
Yeah.
What a cool story. Well, thank you so much for joining me. It's been awesome. Really appreciate all the insights, a little bit of nostalgia about the growth of Kubernetes in our lives in this space. And, it continues to just evolve so fast. So really cool to get all your insights there. Thanks to everyone who tuned in today. If you're enjoying the podcast, subscribe on your favorite podcast provider, wherever you find your podcast. If there's someone you want us to talk to, something you want us to talk about, find us on Twitter at CircleCI. Chandler, again, thank you so much for joining. It's been absolutely fantastic to have you.
You bet. Thanks, Rob.